My remarks are based on our most recent book, 2016, Progressive Schools of Tomorrow, Schools of Today, Progressive Education in the 21st Century. Now, I'm going to also speak about three schools, two that were founded at the turn of the 20th century, and one that was a much more recent school, Central Park East. I should also tell you that I am the product of a progressive school, that I did attend one of the schools that I'm going to be talking about. And frankly, if I had my druthers, you'd all be sitting in a circle, because there is a sense of community that I think Philip has really brought us all together and is creating today. But nevertheless, one of the main practices of progressive schools is that there's less of a hierarchy and more of a community of learners. We talk about social justice. Social justice was not in the vocabulary of the progressive educators at the turn of the century. Perhaps social reconstructionism, perhaps equality, but social justice is a much more recent term in our vocabulary. You've seen the first slide. I apologize for having it up so long, but progressive education is, in fact, one of the most influential and enduring educational movements of the 20th century. It certainly is the longest. And I would also argue that there's a lot we can learn from progressive education that we could use perhaps in some of the schools, the Jewish schools, that would really benefit from the notion of inclusivity and individualized instruction. And I would also argue that for special education, the IEP is the individualized education plan is very similar to education on the Dalton plan or education on the individual system, which was Carlton Washburn's plan in the Midwest. So, progressive education has also come under tremendous criticism, both from conservatives and the neoliberals in the United States from the 30s onward, has often been used as a model by the contemporary small schools movement, but oftentimes not attributed to progressive education, and that has political issues. It's also been used as a model for some, and anti-model for other urban charter schools, which is the big movement right now. Now, there are three different strands of progressive education: the administrative progressivism and/or social efficiency, which the school managers came out of that, the superintendency. I would send you back to David Tyak's book on the rise of the superintendency, to really understand that. Then there's the child-centered, which is more of the Deweyan model, which I will talk about, and also the third piece, which is the social reconstruction, or reconstructing society through the schools. Counts, dare the schools change the social order. Strand 1, administrative progressivism. That's David Tyak, or social efficiency. It was implemented in public schools. It was based on the principles of scientific management techniques. It relied on intelligence tests to place and track the students. And it created vocational schools. It certainly was not a model for spirituality or social justice. It was a way of sorting. It was a way of, in a sense, it led to serious inequality. the justification, of course, for the administrative progressives was that they were meeting the needs of the students. They were testing, they were sorting, and then they would meet the needs of the students and teach them in the most appropriate manner. This, of course, was not the way it turned out to be. I see you agreeing with me. Strand 2 is the child-centered and or what Lawrence Kremen, who was the foremost historian of educational history and progressive education, called the romantic progressives. The small schools, often private schools, or what we would call independent schools. Here in the States, private schools are generally parochial schools, whereas independent schools are the quote-unquote private schools or the English public schools. They attracted middle-class clientele. The children were seen as unique, emphasis on individual growth and potential. And here is something that I think we could really profit from thinking about. And there was definitely potential for spirituality and social justice. I would argue more of the latter, social justice, than the former. Strategies and practices. Well, they were influenced by John Dewey. The individualized study was differentiated instruction. That's the way we refer to it now, but it was individualized study. Problem solving, inquiry-based learning. That's what, education is often old wine in new bottles. That is, we're constantly reinventing the wheel, we're constantly relabeling. So when we say problem solving, today we call it inquiry-based learning. Project method, group or cooperative learning for democratic education. Integrated curriculum, community service. And here is something that's really important because this was the basis of service learning and getting the students out into the community and fostering a relationship between the school and the community. And teacher as facilitator with a broad knowledge base. Strand 3, social reconstructionism. And this is the George Counts piece. Emphasize the community and the greater society, social justice. Schools central to creating a new social order. That's the sense of social meliorism for social justice. It did not become a force in either the public or private schools. Now, case 1, I'm looking at 3 schools. I'm looking at the Dalton School, which I did attend in all honesty, then the City and Country School, and finally Central Park East. Case 1, the Dalton School. It was founded in 1919 by Helen Parkhurst in New York City, and it is located on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. There are several components to the school, to its particular type of progressive education. The Dalton plan, which consists of house, lab, and assignment. The house is the advisory groups, and the advisory groups were set up to foster cooperation, independence, and social awareness. Lab or laboratory time were blocks set aside for students to work individually or cooperatively with or without the teacher. So here you begin to see the development of autonomy in the student. The assignment, which was an outline of each student's course of study for the year. And then first it started as weekly, then monthly. This is also the precursor of the syllabus, so that by the time students went to college, they had no problem with the syllabus because they had been used to the assignment plan. And for Parkhurst, who was the founder, progressive education was, I would argue, a secular religion. What I didn't say was that in reading about the women who founded many of these schools and ultimately writing about them, there's a book that we have called Founding Mothers and Others, Women in Progressive Education. You begin to see the almost messianic-like quality of that these women had, and the notion of progressive education as the new education or the new religion. And anyway, for Parkhurst, progressive education was a secular religion. And during periods of anti-Semitism, particularly in New York City, Dalton admitted significant numbers of Jewish students, although they were mostly German Jewish students and mostly affluent students at the time. But for many people and many Jews in New York City, the progressive schools were the schools that took the children when the other schools did not, when they had very, very stringent quotas. Dalton today is an elite college preparatory school with vestiges of the Dalton Plan and progressive education. The student population is diverse racially and ethnically, but I would argue that affluent students are in the majority, with the tuition of about $50,000 a year plus. They also have something called voluntary contributions, which are not so voluntary. Dalton has made major efforts to recruit and retain students of color and low-income students. There is a strong commitment to teaching students about social justice. But there's very little emphasis on spirituality. The City and Country School, Case 2, founded in 1914 in New York City by Carolyn Pratt, located in Greenwich Village. Based on the notion of Dewey's embryonic community, emphasized inquiry and experimentation and expanding environments. And block play was the linchpin and remains the linchpin of the curriculum. Age grouping, not grades. They refer to the students as the 5s, the 6s, the 7s, etc. And each group has a task which helps maintain the school as community. That is, they have a printing press, they learn how to use the printing press before they move on to the computer. They have a post office, a store. They really learn how to maintain the school through jobs. And I would argue that this particular form of education helps to teach the children how to function in a democratic community. For Pratt, progressive education was a secular religion. If you read her work, if you read Parkhurst's work, it's almost messianic in the way in which they approach progressive education and particularly their visions. City and Country today remains true to the vision of its founder. It balances trying to maintain that original piece with what the 21st century demands. It's mostly white and affluent as it struggles with diversity, given its lack of a sizable endowment. As historically, its parent body once reflected the artistic community of Greenwich Village. Social justice is an important part of its mission. There is no emphasis on spirituality. Case 3 is Central Park East Secondary School. Now that we move from the private or the independent schools to the public school. Founded by Deborah Meyer in 1985 in East Harlem, which was Central Park East Secondary School. It was small, progressive, public secondary school with 3 sister elementary schools as feeders. Debbie was, and is, a democratic socialist committed to social justice. Progressive education was most definitely a secular religion to Deb. Best practices. Based on the practices of the elementary schools, children worked on their own pace, at their own pace. The teacher was facilitator. Parents and staff worked together. There was a shared governance in matters of curriculum, governance of the school, and instruction. It was based on the idea of the Coalition of Essential Schools, which was Ted Sizer, the late educator's educational philosophy. SPES had integrated curriculum, student-centered teaching, advisory system, alternative assessments. They had portfolios, shades of the 70s, committed to social justice. It differed from Dalton and City and Country because the students were from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, predominantly Latino, African American, committed to showing that progressive education could work for low-income students. No spirituality. Today, SPES is not what it was under its founder. She left in the 1990s. It's been pretty much taken apart and put back together. It's known as Central Park East High School. The elementary schools still exist, but they are under attack because of the lack of the type of curriculum that does not sit well with the testing and accountability movement today. What we can learn, the importance of an articulated philosophy, curriculum, and pedagogy in maintaining the uniqueness of small progressive schools. The importance of leadership, Pratt, Parkhurst, Meyer, issues of sustainability, what safeguards you put in place to keep a school going after the founder leaves. Progressive small schools walk a fine line between maintaining progressive principles, modernization in the marketplace. Best practices modeled in the early progressive schools are timeless, I would argue. And evidence that progressive paradox of democratic education for the elite, that is, it started oftentimes with less elite populations, but it became education for the elite oftentimes, but it's not inevitable, and that progressive education can work for low-income children. Progressive education and spirituality, well, historically, progressive education has been secular, with little or no organized religion. However, Dalton did have a Christmas pageant for many years. With a different population, it is no longer, and the only thing that's celebrated is the winter solstice. SPES as a public school could not have any religious practices. It might be possible to integrate spirituality into school practices, but these schools have their own secular rituals. However, other schools with their own emphasis on spirituality can learn from the progressive practices at these schools. It might be a secular spirituality. Progressive education and social justice. All three schools had a commitment to social justice. However, Dalton, City, and Country throughout their histories have largely enrolled white and affluent students. SPES, however, enrolled a majority of low-income students of color and was committed to showing that progressive education could work for all students. The practices of all three schools with respect to social justice should be integrated into all schools. Thank you.